see everyone here today, and just a reminder, we're giving our prayer concerns at the end. We've got some prayers and praises to share, as always, today.
Let's focus.
No falls. Wonderful. We're glad to have Clark back with us after a big adventure of the kind that you don't want to have. Right? Well, now you guys are just messing with me.
Keep you on your toes.
Oh my gosh. Okay, and I don't know if over the last few weeks all of you have met Alyssa Topper. Alyssa is married to Jacob, and we're fortunate to have Jacob with her today. But Alyssa has started coming to our class, and if you've not met her, please do. And hopefully you've all met Jacob, at least. By the way, a first has happened this weekend. The first in the history of the Wilshire residency program.
Okay.
That is, we've had a resident house teepee. Toilet paper. It's a very good one. It's thorough. And it's TP's house that was TP. Timothy Peoples.
Oh, really?
See how that works? Yeah. Really, really good.
It still exists. Sounds like an inside job.
Yeah, that's still a thing. So yeah, that's still a thing. Yeah.
Such a mess.
Okay, did everyone get a handout? I've got a handout today. Because we got a lot of ground to cover.
Oh, I didn't get any.
We're going to have Bob Amy with us today, who's visiting from next door, I think. Yeah, from the Quantity class. And has everyone else been here? Yes, we're delighted that Hart is back. Wonderful.
We need to send this around to anybody.
All right, if you have not signed up for Thanksgiving dinner and you want to be at one of our tables, Dave has a list. Anyone need it? If you change your mind, see him at the end of class. If you haven't paid, has everyone paid? Has everyone paid yet, Dave? If you haven't paid, stop by the front desk and pay. Let's do that. Do you need? Okay, Hart needs to sign. Very good. Okay, well, Chris, how was the wedding?
Very good, thank you very much.
We missed you last week.
Came off without a hitch.
Okay, without a hitch. You got hitched without a hitch. I'm working on wordplay today.
It wasn't a hitch.
Okay, very good. Well, now, why are we got a different topic today that's sort of off topic from our minor epistles that we've been working our way through, but yet it's also related, and I will remind you how we got here. So this is because a few weeks ago we were talking about 2 Peter chapter 2 and the teaching about false teaching and false teaching. And there was an excellent question that was asked at that point about, well, how do we know what false teaching is today? And how do we know that this conversation we're engaged in as a church right now is not representative of false teaching somehow or another? And so we took a week, or did we take 2 weeks? We took 2 weeks to sort of discuss that in some detail. And out of that arose another question, and Chris was the one who expressed it most clearly, I believe, to say, okay, well, what about marriage? And that's how now, it's just serendipitous or providential or dumb luck that it's ended up that we're doing this on this Sunday. So what I want to say, and I've got a little note to you at the top of my notes, in case these get passed along for anyone who doesn't hear me say this, this is not part of my evil plot for world domination. That this all lined up this way, right? I have not been working for months strategizing to say, when could I teach a lesson on Christian marriage? Had no aspirations to do that, but it just so happens it's lined up this way, and here we are. There are, unfortunately, some folks who think that I am the mastermind behind everything that's going on in the church right now, and I will tell you, if I were the mastermind of it, it would be a lot smoother.
Now, Mark, you behave.
Okay. Anyhow, so that's how we've gotten to this place today. There's an excellent book I discovered that I'm giving you a reference to here, and it's called "From This Day Forward: Rethinking the Christian Wedding." Now, you may think, oh, well, they're trying to upend the Christian wedding. No, that's not what this is about. This is written by a Presbyterian clergywoman who's a professor at Columbia Seminary in Atlanta. And it's just a really excellent book that talks about some of the challenges that clergy face in dealing with weddings. It talks about the history of marriage. It talks about the biblical verses. It talks about a bunch of stuff related to understanding what a wedding is about. And so I'm going to refer to that book off and on, but at the risk of protecting myself from charges of plagiarism, there are large chunks of the material in your handout that come almost verbatim from that book. So I'm just telling you. I'm not giving a citation every time. This is not an academic paper. But we've got so much to say today that I thought you might like to have a handout on this.
Mark, can I just say one quick
Yeah.
thing? In line with your plans for world domination, this also was perfect timing. There was a program on Channel 13 within the last week on a frontline program called Growing Up Trans.
Oh,
And if you didn't see it, you ought to go online and watch it. It's incredibly informative and heartbreaking.
okay, I'll go find it. Thank you.
Was it on radio or television?
Television, Channel
And
13.
what was the name of it?
Growing Up Trans.
It was a repeat.
Yeah. All right, so I'm going to lay out some questions that we're not going to answer right now, but I want you to have them in the back of your head. All right, because we'll talk about these as we go. What makes a wedding a Christian wedding? So we hear talk from time to time of a Christian wedding. What is that? What makes a marriage a Christian marriage? What portion of most wedding ceremonies today could be considered sacred, and what portion could be considered something not sacred? Maybe more secular or more of an event. Just a side note, weddings that are done here at Wilshire, some of you have been through this, we are really mean about this. We require sacred music to be used and not secular music, for example. In fact, there's even an approved list that you typically choose from because we want to have a more traditional wedding ceremony here. Is marriage in the United States a legal commitment governed by the state, or is it a religious commitment governed by the church? That's a trick question, by the way. We'll talk about that. How should we as Christians reconcile the Old Testament witness of all kinds of family relationships, mainly dysfunctional in the Old Testament, including polygamy? What is the history of marriage, and how has it changed over time? So those are just some plaques on the side of the head. I hope you'll think about those as we talk through our lesson today. I've given you some just facts that are interesting. I'm not going to go through all of them here, but this goes front to back, by the way, so don't skip the page. One of the things that I think is overlooked when we talk in the church today about Christian marriage, leave the LGBT question out of it for a moment. We're in a totally different place on heterosexual marriage and relationships than we've ever been in the history of the church. And certainly than in modern history. And a lot of that is driven by some of the data that's here. People are waiting later to get married. 27 on average for a woman, 29 on average for a man. Well, there are a lot of consequences for that. That also leads to the rise, 900% rise in cohabitation. As you'll see here, over the past 50 years. There are some interesting trends about economics, race, and education, and how that plays into the marriage. Again, among heterosexual couples, the poorer you are, the less likely you are to get married today. The whiter and better educated you are, the more likely you are to get married today. I bet you didn't know that. Okay, you think about these and they'll start to make a little more sense. There's a lot of data behind this. The revolution has happened in women's role in the workplace. Higher levels of education for women has certainly changed this. There is significant data, for example, that shows in the black community in America, women are by and large better educated than men. And that changes marriage goals. When you're looking for someone to marry who has a similar perspective or outlook or experience as you, that has shifted that. We have more not only interracial but interfaith marriages today. 1 in 5 divorces among people who married for the first time happens within the first 5 years. And there's a phenomenon known as the starter marriage. Now, no one gets married thinking they're going to have a starter marriage. Well, not many people, at least. Well, this is my first stepping stone. No, people get married with the greatest of intentions, right? But sometimes it doesn't work out. The United States has one of the highest rates of marriage in the world, but also one of the highest divorce rates in the world. We get married more often and we get divorced more often. And here's the thing. The average cost of a wedding in the United States in 2012 was $29,000. And I will tell you, just for comparison, the officiating minister is not getting that money.
Mark?
Yes.
Here I am.
No.
Question. When you said that, when you were talking about the delayed marriage time and something like that, are there any statistics broken down on race about cohabitation?
There are. I don't have them here. But it's not just race that's interesting, it's also socioeconomic status. Because the reality is, the poorer you are, the more difficult it is for you to get married and have a sustainable life,
Yes.
right? And by the same token, the older you are, the same thing happens in reverse. Because of what happens with Social Security benefits and with maybe other retirement plans. So it is not uncommon for a widow and a widower, for example, to come together and find love today after they both have lost spouses. But it's not economically feasible for them to get married. So those are some of the factors at play here.
Where I live particularly, there are several there who are in that situation. One of them is a really nice lady that I've become friends with down the hall from me. And her mate has Alzheimer's, doesn't know half the time. And she every single day goes to see him. She stays with him like a half a day or so. Very, very devoted. And yet for economical reasons, they can't be married. And it's sad. It's sad to see
Right.
that happen.
I was trying to say, I think Florida is a state where a lot of the seniors who are retiring to that state are cohabitating as opposed to marriage because it will change the rules.
That's right. Okay, so we got that laid down. I'm just trying to set the plate for you here, okay? Now, think about weddings today. And there's a fascinating trend that's been going on for several years, but I would say my observation is it has ratcheted up in the past 10 years. George will tell you that when he came here as pastor 27 years ago, he was doing a wedding almost every weekend, sometimes 2 in weekend. Trish was a wedding coordinator then. I've not gone back and looked at the official records, but from what I can understand, we probably as a church were doing 50 or more weddings a year. A lot of weddings. Today, we probably do 10 to 12 a year. Now, that's a dramatic decline. Why is that? Well, there are several factors at play. It's not because we've changed anything, it's just the world has changed around us. There are a lot more destination weddings than there used to be. A whole lot more destination weddings than there used to be. There's a lot more weddings that happen in venues that are specifically designed for weddings, where you can have the wedding and the reception all in one place, and it's sort of a package deal. And you know, I've said all along, if we would serve alcohol here, we could up our wedding business. And I think that'd be an easy vote right now. I think we can get that slid in.
The Arboretum is one of those destination weddings.
Yes, perfect example. The Arboretum, beautiful place,
Yeah.
right? Beautiful, beautiful. So
You
more and more
get your
people are.
choice of an itty bitty garden to the grand deal.
Yeah. John, Eric, and Shannon are not here today because of Sloan's issues, but I did their wedding at White Rock Lake, and it was
Oh,
beautiful.
Yeah, that's pretty.
Right. So that's happening more and more. Also, in the data, there's an uptick, significant uptick, in people who are getting married without religious officiant. So justice of the peace or someone else, and like it or not,
certified online.
you have a friend who you want to participate in the ceremony, and you get them ordained online.
That's
Right? Now, that gets to the question of, is what's happening a religious experience? Is it sacred or is it secular? And I know the answer is probably something I want you to think about all this as we work through this. The wedding industry, and that's like the military industrial complex, this is sort of a catch-all phrase, right? The wedding industry has more influence over weddings today than any religious organization or any cleric does. Look at the magazines. Look at the bridal shops, the expos. I mean, all these things really drive this. In Las Vegas, there's a wonderful section in this book that I've referenced where she talks about going sort of to observe in Las Vegas. And there are 2,000 weddings in Las Vegas every week. Every week. 2,000 weddings in Las Vegas. And some of them are literally drive-by weddings. You can stay in the car, drive up, roll down the window, and an officiant will marry you.
Now,
All right.
do you go back there for your divorce?
Actually, they do both.
Yeah.
Yeah, they do both. Yeah. Walt Disney World's a popular wedding destination, right? About 1,200 weddings happen at Walt Disney World every year. Think about that. How many weekends are there in a year?
But don't you think more people are living together today too?
Well, yes, absolutely.
Let's go have it.
Yeah, all that plays into this. All right. Now, what does your faith have to do with your wedding or with your marriage, regardless of how any of this happens? There's a quote that the author of this book has: anyone can enter into marriage. Some who do are Christian by virtue of their baptism. So one answer to this question is that a Christian marriage happens when two Christians marry. A Christian marriage is not about the process you went through to get hitched. It's about who you are as people. Now, hold that thought, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Here's another question I want to challenge you with. Does someone else having a civil wedding ceremony, let's say at the drive-through window in Las Vegas, officiated by Elvis, this is real stuff, I'm not making this up, does that in any way lessen your own church-based sacred marriage? Now, interesting point, in our Baptist tradition, almost anything that is sanctioned as an official endorsement of persons in leadership by the church gets voted on in some way. You have to be elected to serve on a committee here, right? And certainly if you're to be ordained either to the ministry or as a deacon, that goes through an approval process. Yet there's no history anywhere that I can find within our Baptist tradition of ever voting to give approval to who should be married. So you could be a scoundrel, and Lord knows some people are, right? I've married some scoundrels.
Quit Allison?
No, not personally. I have officiated at some lovely weddings, but also, I mean, there are times I've stood at the altar with a couple knowing in my heart of hearts that this marriage is not going to make it. I mean, I knew from the day we started it wasn't going to make it. But that's not what they wanted to hear from me in that moment. Great question. Yeah. Do I really have a choice? I mean, yes, I do. Yes, I do. But if these are church members,
Well,
right?
one of them is a church member.
Right? Or they're the children of church members.
Well, and people can change.
And there's the other answer. I can be wrong. I can be wrong.
That's shocking.
And
There goes world domination right there.
and the grace of God can move in people's lives and bring wonderful love. And so, yeah, Donna?
I've married some scoundrels being a prison chaplain myself. And I'm not talking about prisoners getting married. But I view that as they wanted a minister there to do this. And if I can offer a prayer, which I do in the service, or quote some scripture, or be the presence of Christ in the midst, in that union, then maybe they will hear, and on down the road, hearts will be changed. If I refused to do that, then the person, or maybe both of them, who Mama wanted the minister, they could care less, they would never darken the door of a church, period, if I refused.
Well said.
So that's how I have reconciled that situation.
Well said. Yes. Julie?
Mark, I think you should do what our minister did. We were married at a destination wedding in Clarksville, Texas.
Oh.
/ holiness minister.
Okay.
Who still had 2 guns on his hips. And when he said, "Let no man put asunder," he grabbed his guns and shot them.
Okay, I need to get my license to carry. Linda?
I think Jesus can get his foot in the door any way he wants.
Yeah.
And any way that gets Jesus' foot in the door is a good thing.
I agree with that. Was someone about to speak?
No.
So this is we as the church want to be present anywhere we're invited to be the presence of Jesus, right? So that's part of that. Now, when I as a minister officiate a wedding, am I acting on behalf of the church? Am I acting on behalf of God? Or am I acting on behalf of the state? What do you think?
Well, church and state.
God, I have a God over here.
Well, I think both.
All of the above.
At least 2 of them.
At least 2 of the 3.
God and state. I go for 2.
Thank you, Carrie.
Because it is a binding legal document with the legal rules.
Well, yeah, so there you have it. Now, if you've ever been to a wedding that I've done, there are 2 things I don't do. One of them is I do not ask the father of the bride who gives this woman in marriage.
Oh, really?
No.
What do you say? You don't say anything. What
Because in my view, the woman is not the property of the father.
That's true. Amen.
This is not chattel, right? So what I say instead, in a traditional wedding setting, is who blesses this woman in marriage?
That's good. Michelle.
And we're talking about the family blessing, which is a very important thing, right? The other thing that I do not do at the end is say, by the power vested in me by the state of Texas, I pronounce you husband and wife. Because I don't care about the power of the state of Texas. I will sign the document that has to be signed and sent in, because that's what the state of Texas requires. But the reality is, someone else could sign that document, it doesn't have to be me, and we could still have a wedding. So in the eyes of the church, those are two separate things. It's just that we have brought them together for so long, and I would say the Hollywoodization of weddings has, sort of contributed to this idea. Now, Allison is out of town this weekend. She'll be so disappointed. She wanted me to have a video clip for you this morning to begin this whole lesson with that wonderful scene from The Princess Bride. You all seen that? Yeah, which, right, that would have set the whole thing, so just keep that in mind as well. All right, this is a difficult question, and there's a movement afoot right now in some of our Texas Baptist churches. There's some pastors in Texas who have put forward the idea that they will no longer sign marriage licenses issued by the state of Texas or a county in Texas. And by the way, the marriage license are not a state document, they're a county document. County by county.
I just want to throw in another perspective here. Being a native of the Netherlands and also having traveled to Finland recently, in those two countries, you have to be married by the government. If you want to be married in a church, that's your choice. But you have to be married in a legal thing. So, in Holland, you go to the courthouse and you get that done before you go to church. So clear distinction, separation between church and state in that country. And in Finland, you couldn't get married unless you could read. So the church was in charge of making sure that you could read.
Yeah, so this is a great example, Lady. Thank you for that, because we have an American perspective on this that is our perspective, but it's not the way things are in the rest of the world.
That's right,
right?
And that's important to remember.
And this is also a common idea in parts of Europe, that there is the legal thing that happens, right? And then there's the religious thing that happens, and they're separate.
But
all right?
probably in Italy, it's all church.
I would imagine.
I would too.
I don't know for sure. Okay, so it's a real struggle for me to think about what is my role in a wedding. Am I an agent of the state, or am I an agent of the church? And if so, how does that responsibility fall, and what does it mean for me? So keep thinking about that one as well. Does my responsibility change if I do a wedding at White Rock Lake versus inside this building here? I'm still the same person. I'm still employed the same way, right? Question. Now, I'm not going to go through all of this, but I've given you an incomplete brief history of marriage. And I want to just hit some highlights before we get here.
I have a question, just because you mentioned, I was like, it may sound like I'm intuitive, but I really am curious. If you do a wedding that's not at Wilshire, do the same music rules and everything apply?
No.
Okay.
No, I could dress up like Elvis.
Okay. I didn't know.
Yeah, I don't
Because back when
want to
I
do
thought
that,
I was
by the
going
way.
to get married, I really did have issues with the music rules, because there was this movie about the mouse. I can't remember the name of the movie. I think Great American Tale. You know that Somewhere Out There song?
You can't do that here.
I know, and I wanted that in my wedding, but
Yeah.
I'm 50 now, so I'm not too worried about it.
Oh, you never know, right, Donna?
Well, here's another wrinkle, and I think, Gina, are you in the,
Yeah, she's over there.
there's Gina over there. As chaplains, when I marry someone, I'm not marrying them representing Wilshire Baptist Church. I'm endorsed by the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship. So, then I guess I'm representing the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship and their stance, because if they didn't like what I was doing, they'd yank my endorsement. But I'm still a Baptist minister. So, I mean, Gina, you probably run into this too. There's different ways to look at these issues as a chaplain, not affiliated with a local church per se. Gina, what do you think about that?
Well, and then to perform them at the bedside in the ICUs, the chapel, in the hospital, in the grounds of the hospital. So it's, various places and there, but yes, definitely representing a Baptist minister.
Yeah.
Endorsement.
Now I want you to keep this thought in mind because it's going to be relevant in just a moment when we talk about some of the history of marriage. And I know that you may be thinking, you asked me what time it is, and I'm telling you how to watch. But I hope that you will find this background to be instructive. And if it takes us more than 1 week to do this, it'll take more than 1 week to do this.
That's a shock.
And that's, I know. Nothing's simple in this class, right? All right, so the earliest forms of marriage are believed to have originated in Mesopotamia around 2000 BC, but no surprise here, we don't have a record of that, right? That's sort of oral tradition that gets passed down. So fast forward a whole lot, and we'll get to the Old Testament out of that. In the Jewish tradition found in the Old Testament, we see marriage as an entity, but we don't have a lot of detail in the Old Testament about what a marriage meant or how it happened. We have a lot of evidence of men taking multiple wives at different times. There's all sorts, it's a very different culture than we know today. And so while we can't dismiss the Old Testament out of hand with this, we need to acknowledge if you're looking for a contemporary understanding of marriage, there's only a couple of things that are really going to be helpful to you out of the Old Testament, and we'll talk about some of those down the line here. Here's an interesting fact. For the first 1,000 years of the New Testament era, the time of Jesus forward, so for half of the church's existence, the church had little to do with marriage. Weddings were usually done at home, very small ceremonies, if a ceremony at all. In some cases, it was simply coming together. And that the act of declaring that you were married was marriage. It was a domestic label. It was a legal category in some cases, but it was not, for the first 1,000 years, really a church-sanctioned event. Now, we do read about marriage in the New Testament, and we'll talk about some examples of that. And we read more than that about people who are identified as married couples, or they appear to be married couples. However, we have no record in the Bible about what those marriages look like or what happened to create them. Sometimes I think people have the assumption that the vows and everything that we use in a traditional wedding ceremony is somehow in the Bible. None of that's in the Bible. No, and we'll talk about the history of that, Don.
I think it's interesting that the first miracle, it talked more about the celebration afterward than it did what happened during the ceremony. And then also at the birth of Christ, we don't know really how Mary and Joseph were married, what happened. We just know the beautiful birth that preceded.
Right.
So
yeah, there's no record in the Bible of Mary and Joseph being married.
Right.
They're betrothed.
Yes.
Yeah.
And in that culture, in that time, betrothal was a precursor to marriage. But again, it was a very different concept than what we would have in mind today. The church father Tertullian, who lived in the late 2nd century, early 3rd century, wrote about marriage, and his belief was that a person should only be married once and should not be remarried after a spouse died, because you could only have one marriage per lifetime. Now, late 2nd, early 3rd century, and that idea has persisted in some parts of certainly Christendom, not all, there were later theologians and writers who came up with this idea that that's related, and that is that a person could not remarry if they were divorced because it would be committing adultery. Now, back in the late 1980s, when I worked for the Southern Baptist Home Mission Board, this was a hot topic of contention because in those days, and I think this may still be true with Southern Baptists, I'm not sure, in those days they passed a policy that said that the only way you could be appointed a home missionary by the Southern Baptist Convention if you were divorced is if you did not remarry. That they were okay with you being divorced, but they were not okay with you remarrying. That was where they drew the line. And so there's a thread that goes all the way back here to Tertullian. Now, a lot of other history here. Augustine, of course, weighs heavily in everything in Christian history. And it's Augustine in 401 AD who really gives us the first significant theological treatise on marriage. And he cited 3 purposes for marriage, and only 3 purposes for marriage. Procreation, number 1. Mutual fidelity, number 2. To protect each other from fornication. Do you understand what he's saying there?
Yeah.
Number 3, a sacramental significance that brought the whole idea of the wedding not only into the church, but shaped it as a sacrament of the church. He didn't identify it right on the same level as baptism and the Lord's Supper, but he gave it that kind of weight. One of his arguments was that just as you cannot be unbaptized, you cannot be unmarried. Now, that seems like a foreign concept to us sitting in this room today, but that has shaped a lot of Catholic theology and history through the years. Donna?
I'm just getting ready to say in the Roman Catholicism, and I don't know about Orthodox, but in Roman Catholicism it's a sacrament still, and only a priest can marry you because it is sacramental.
Yes. And you've got to be a member in good standing.
That's right.
Of the church for the priest to do
Catholic
that.
Church.
For the priest to do that, right?
The only way you can marry is if you have been married before, if that first marriage is annulled.
Right.
Then you can marry again.
So we're going to talk about Henry VIII in a moment, and this Henry VIII really helped shape a lot of this. Like it or not, right? So Augustine's the one who brought marriage into the church. The earliest wedding liturgy we have in the Western Church dates to the 6th century in Verona. There are others. It's around that. It's the 8th century, not the 80th century, with Gregory the Great that we see for the first time a more robust explanation of this idea that the marriage of a couple is like the marriage of Christ and the church that we read about in Revelation 21. We'll talk about that again. All right. The whole idea of giving rings, 11th century Spain. In England and France, 11th century, we get some of the vows that we still use in some variation today. At that point, we get the line, "With this ring I thee wed." That comes out of that. Now, beyond Augustine, in Roman Catholic theology, everything has to pass through Thomas Aquinas as well. And Aquinas really shaped the view of marriage in the Roman Catholic Church for centuries. And Aquinas is the one who places a priority on procreation as not only a reason, but the primary reason for marriage. And he calls marriage a sacramental grace. Now that is big code language in Roman Catholicism, right? A sacramental grace. The idea, and if you think this idea is dead, that marriage is primarily for procreation, I will tell you that within the past 3 months, there has been communication circulating in another Sunday school class in this church by a male an older male who was perpetuating the idea of Thomas Aquinas that the primary purpose of marriage is for procreation.
How is that different from Augustine?
Well, it's not. It's further. It's just more.
Okay.
It's more, right? So the problem with that is when we get to the biblical text, we'll learn more about relationship, right? And when we look at the Genesis texts, and I'm getting ahead of myself, but I need to sort of answer this one question before we get there. I'm going to make a case that this is about relationship more than just about procreation. So if you follow Augustine's line of reasoning that leads to Aquinas' line of reasoning, and the primary purpose of marriage is for procreation, then that leaves a lot of people out of marriage. Marrying later in life, or couples who are unable to conceive, and so forth. So just hold that thought there, all right? For most of world history, up until the middle of the 18th century, which is not that long ago in the big scope of things, marriages were typically arranged. And so that line that I don't use about who gives this woman to be married is residual of that idea of women being the property of their families, and of women in particular being owned by their fathers. Now, there's all sorts of creepy in that idea of daughters being sort of the property of their fathers, and I won't chase that rabbit right now, but just think about that as well. Okay. The arranged marriage and the idea of marrying for love really comes later. So today's Reformation Sunday. We're talking about the Reformers a lot. Clearly, choir people, we'll be talking about this next week too. Give me the hour. So we'll catch you up. The Protestant Reformers rebelled on marriage against Catholicism too. And the Reformers said, no, marriage is not a sacrament of the church. Now, Martin Luther believed marriage is given by God, is blessed by God, but he saw it as a secular contract. Interesting. John Calvin, the founder of Presbyterian theology, did not see marriage as a sacrament of the church. And I love this quote from him. He called it a good and holy ordinance of God, just like farming, building, cobbling, and barbering.
He suggested hard work.
That's a gentle interpretation. Thank you for that. Yeah. So most of the liturgy that we use today in a traditional Christian wedding, we owe to something called the Book of Common Prayer. Now, I will tell you, as a Baptist going through seminary, there is no formal wedding liturgy that you were given in a Baptist seminary. It does not exist. And so you've got to go find it on your own somewhere. Most of us draw somehow upon the Book of Common Prayer, which is, again, Anglican. But that's the idea that most people have about what a traditional wedding is, and that's where we get a lot of the vows and the language, and we adapt it in our own way. Now, the Book of Common Prayer, in its origins about marriage, owes a whole lot to Henry VIII. Now, if you recall the story of Henry VIII, remember that the Pope would not give him the annulment that he wanted from his first marriage. And so he created a workaround with the separation from the Catholic Church and created the Church of England, right? And that just only, go watch the Tudors if you don't know that story. You can catch up on it. It's all, but a lot of that stuff sort of came out of this. Now, in response, Catholicism moved to solidify, to double down on the idea that marriage is the sacrament of the church. In fact, at the Council of Trent, they declared it to be one of 7 sacraments of the church. And all couples were required to marry in Christian ceremonies with priests attending. So in the eyes of the Catholic Church, from that point forward, it was not a wedding, it was not a marriage, if it didn't happen with a priest attending inside the Catholic Church. Now, as I mentioned earlier, it wasn't until the late 18th century that people in Western Europe and North America began to think of love as an actual reason for marriage. Now, you can go back and find ballads and odes and poems about romantic love prior to that, but most of those were idealistic and aspirational, not realistic in that time. It would be about like us writing about living on Mars, right? We can conceive that idea, but it's not our lived reality right now. So for most of world history, marriage has been about alliances between families, real estate deals, labor, making sure you had labor to work the land, accumulating wealth, and ensuring that you had legal heirs. These are some of the things that really drove these marriage decisions. And you can read a lot about how couples came together because of arranged marriages, and in the best of situations, they grew to love each other over time, right? And this is close enough in our history that I dare say some of our grandparents and great-grandparents got married for reasons similar to this, not necessarily out of love the way we might see it today. Now, up until the 18th century, brides in Europe came with dowries. That was very important. There's typically a golden age of marriage found in the United States from 1947 until, so post-World War II, right, up until sometime in the 60s with the sexual revolution. And think of the TV shows that encapsulate that, right, and really have helped give us an idea of this idyllic time that probably was less than a 20-year period in American history. And yet, we think of that as the end-all, in some ways, of what marriage should be. But those of you who were alive in those times know that it wasn't as idyllic as it all appeared all the time, right? But that's the image we have of that. So, in the latter part of the 20th century, the whole idea of marriage was challenged by the rise of women in the workplace, the invention of the birth control pill, the civil rights movement, the acceptance of interracial marriage, which up until the late 20th century was illegal. Illegal. And then the increasing numbers of divorces that happened. Now here's a fascinating quote I want to read to you from an author named, it's a woman whose last name is Kuntz, and she wrote a book called Marriage, A History. Marriage today is fairer, more fulfilling, more intimate, more passionate, more faithful, more loving than most couples of the past would ever dare to imagine. But if it doesn't work out that way, it seems less bearable to people. Relationships that might have seemed bearable 100 years ago, even 50 years ago, just seem intolerable as our expectations have risen. So the point of this is that, to use a phrase, it's the best of times and the worst of times for being married, particularly in America today, because those who experience happy marriages are happier in marriage than perhaps they've ever been before. But those who experience unhappiness in marriage, the fuse is a lot shorter to get there because the bar has been raised. The expectations are higher about what marriage should be. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Sure.
Can anyone affirm that from your observation? Yeah. All right. Let's take one biblical text, and then I'll pick up the others next week. Genesis 1, 26 through 31. You know this passage. Then God said, let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, over the cattle, and so forth and so on. God created humankind in his image, and this humankind is actually an accurate translation here. King James says man, I believe, right? In the image of God, he created them, plural, male and female, he created them. God blessed them, said, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, have dominion over, and it's all good. I'm telescoping this. You know this passage. So what's being said here in this passage in Genesis?
Male and female.
Okay, so what the scripture says is that God created them, male and female. God created two kinds of.
And he created them for one another.
Yeah, does it say that?
Well, doesn't it? Because doesn't it say that, well, not that specific scripture, but when it says he saw that
Well, we gotta get to Genesis 2 for that one.
you know, and
Yeah.
he needed somebody.
Hold that thought, because that shows up in Genesis 2. Remember, there are two different creation accounts in Genesis. And we've talked, they're given for different reasons, and they come from different parts of the oral tradition. In this passage, that is actually more inclusive in its quality of male and female.
He does say be fruitful and multiply.
He says be fruitful and multiply. So that's where Augustine and Aquinas pick up and say marriage is for procreation. Be fruitful and multiply. Okay.
But as written, God is neither male nor female.
Right.
And male and female are equal.
Yeah, in Genesis 1 they are.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a distinction between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 that's always interesting to look at. So what does it mean that God commands creation, the human creation, to be fruitful and multiply? Well, I think you can think of this in a couple of different ways. One is, if you're starting humanity,
Yeah, right, you gotta do something.
you need to be fruitful and multiply. Physically, right? That was God's plan to fill the earth. Now, are any of y'all familiar with the full quiver movement that exists today? The full quiver movement. Okay, this is a branch of Christian thought that takes this passage very literally and says that is the duty of Christian couples to have as many children as they possibly can. No birth control at all. Right. Okay? And that's a thing today. And that is a subgroup within evangelical Christianity today. It's a subgroup. It's not the main thing, but it is there with this.
Which has been a Catholic and Mormon thing for a long time. I mean, it's not
Right.
really new. I mean, I'm aware of the evangelical people that have screwed up families that are pushing it, but I mean, it's been a, you know.
Oh, right.
It's not like they're coming up with
Okay,
something new.
we got to get to our prayer time, so let me just give you, we'll pick up with this passage next week, but think about this. Here's a thought to leave you with on this passage. What are other ways that this passage to be fruitful and multiply might play out other than procreation? What are some other ways that we might be fruitful and multiply as humans other than procreation? Now, we've got a lot more to talk about. A whole lot more. I thought this was maybe ambitious for me to get through all of this in one lesson. But I hope you're finding it helpful as we go on. Hang on to your handout. I'll try to have some more next week if we need those. So as we go offline,